No time for questions, but if you feel, I will be in the back for a little while, and feel free to come by and talk to me. Thank you.
Over the year style.
Okay. Doesn't matter which year.
Not really. Okay. I'm just going to stick this in your pocket.
All right.
Round side down usually.
Round side down. Okay. And a little cropped off on the side. That should be fine. Yeah, it'll be okay.
All right, next up we have James Pearson on a contentious topic, don't write documentation.
So, as you might have guessed by the title of my talk, I'm not a writer by trade. And as you might have guessed by the Electronic Frontier Foundation sweatshirt and the scraggly beard, I'm a system administrator. So documentation for me is just a way of ensuring that everything continues to work, because at the end of the day, that's my job, is to make sure that everything works and our users are happy. Yeah, that's me. That's website, Twitter, etc. I'll put that at the end as well. I work for a company called iFixit. Our goal is to teach everyone to be able to repair everything, because we think that repair is just an important part of the product lifecycle that often gets ditched in favor of recycling. Recycling is great, but you should be able to repair and reuse things before then. Helps save the environment, helps save money, and you get a connection to your stuff that you don't get normally. So to do that, we have a variety of guides on how to repair things that are on our website. They're very heavily image focused with bullets on the side. And it's all a wiki-based platform too, a very structured wiki-based system. So that's why yesterday I was one of the few people who said, yes, wikis are actually acceptable documentation. This is an example of a user-contributed guide. About half our guides are user-contributed. There's this guy named Nicholas who just joined in December of last year, and he decided that he would just produce a full set of repair guides for his Mercedes-Benz. And so he made just these wonderful, high-quality guides that tell you how to do all sorts of things that mean nothing to me because I don't know enough about cars, but they're great. We also have a software as a service platform called Dazuki, which means that we provide the platform that we use for writing documentation to other companies. This is mostly used for manufacturers who run it in their assembly lines. So that way workers can go through and see step by step, this is what I do now, next I do this and this. That's all great, but I'm not really here to talk to you about that. So don't write documentation. It sounds like a very controversial thing, and I figure that controversial was the best way to go, because normally when I'm talking about documentation, I'm trying to convince people that they should write it. And that seems like a silly talk to give at a conference about documentation. Like, you guys are already convinced that we should write documentation. You know that it's important. And this comes down to that good documentation's worst enemy is bad documentation. This is something that I pretty firmly believe. And that's because I hang out with a lot of people who are not writers by trade. They're programmers, and they just hate documentation. There's someone on my team who sometimes says things like, oh, I don't ever read the documentation because I know it is going to be wrong. And that is extremely frustrating to me as someone who writes documentation. And the thing is, the documentation is really kind of special. It's not like software. So we had an image processing library that we were using to do all of those images, and had rectangles and circles and things on them. And it just had crazy bugs. When we said draw a square on the screen, it would actually just draw lines all across the screen and do crazy stuff. And we upgraded to a newer version that fixed that bug and then introduced a new one, and that was just how it always was. And the lesson we learned out of that is just don't use that library. That library is terrible. And so we didn't. We rewrote our image system to use something else. However, with documentation, the lesson that people tend to learn is documentation in general is bad. I don't really know why this is, but we just have something different in our brains about docs, where a couple bad examples, we just generalize them to everything, and then we don't read documentation at all, anywhere. And we as a culture are really just kind of numb to documentation. We're not always as actively against it as my coworker is, but you'll notice that right when you get a new product and you open it up and there's the packaging, you're pulling everything out, there's probably a manual in there, and you don't even look at it. Like, much less read it and, figure out the information in it. You're just going to pull out the thing and be like, oh, that documentation is just crap. I know it without even looking at it, so I'm just not going to look and not going to deal with that. And that's something that we need to deal with as a group of documentarians, is trying to increase the level of documentation across the board, so that people no longer are that numb to documentation. And I think that we're doing a good job with that in certain subsets of communities. So like the Python community has great documentation in general. Another reason this is important is because of broken window syndrome. There was a study that was done in the 80s, I think, maybe 90s, where they were determining that when you have a neighborhood and you have, they're just observing it and there was no real crime there, and then once they broke one window, then people saw that there was a broken window, and all of a sudden you started getting more broken windows and graffiti and various other bits and pieces of crime. There's some debate as to whether or not this is actually true with crime, but is most definitely true with software. When you see that there's just this kind of crappy code somewhere, or there's missing docs or missing tests or whatever, you kind of internalize that as it's okay for things to not really be that great here, and you don't hold yourself to the same high standard. And so when we have documentation that's crappy in our own projects, it tells everyone else working on the project that it's okay to have crappy documentation. And we really, really don't want that. We want to have a high standard that everyone upholds themselves to. And so to do that, we just need to make sure that we're always making really high quality documentation. As an aside, outdated docs are something that people, programmers complain about all the time. They say things like, the docs are always outdated, and I just look at the code, and that's a really easy thing to fix, assuming that you have some sort of an approval process before your things ship. So whenever we want to make any changes in our software, we have to submit the changes, and other people have to approve them before it ever gets accepted. And that is really, really valuable, because it means that we can ensure that it's not just code that we're ever shipping, but it's code plus docs. And actually, it's really more than that. It's code plus docs plus tests, and also plus metrics and alerts. That's me speaking as a software engineering major rather than a computer science major. I recognize that there are a lot of important things besides just the code that we produce. There's all of these things, and they're really important. And notably, I want people to add in alerts so that it is them that get notified in the middle of the night when their ship breaks, and not me, because I don't want to deal with that. I have a new mic coming. Hello? Okay, cool. So the first category that I just really, really hate are auto-generated docs. I know we had a couple people talk about this before, but it's a very specific kind of auto-generated docs. So Perl is a god-awful language. It's a terrible language, but Larry Wall is a fantastic writer. This book is just an absolute joy to read because he has a really good way of explaining things clearly and also having a little bit of humor and things, and it's great. Actually, the reason that it's a terrible language is because he's such a good writer. He tried to model the language off of natural languages, and it just did not work out well. So one of the well-known things in that book, in the Camel book, is that there are 3 great virtues of a programmer. And those are laziness, impatience, and hubris. And laziness is kind of the problem here that we run into. Have you ever run across documentation like this? Like, this is crap. Or this is another one that I found from one of my professor's projects that I went back and found. And this is the entire documentation for this class. It's too small for you to read, but you can tell that there's just not anything there. Like, we have a calendar-specific settings class. There's no information about it. You can construct it. It doesn't take any arguments, and I have no idea what it does or what I'm supposed to do with it, and this just is not useful. And the problem is that JavaDoc is really a good tool, but it's just gone bad. Like, programmers have this thing where they think that because the computer can pull out certain pieces of information, then it's suitable for making their entire documentation for them. And that's just not the case, because and Larry actually recognizes this in the full definition where he's talking about laziness. He says that true laziness is in documenting your programs well so that other people don't come and bother you about it. And we just don't do that like we're supposed to. I don't know. Really, the root of this is that computers suck. And specifically, it's that they suck at writing documentations that humans have to read. Humans are not computers. We find this again over and over when we're trying to produce software. And so it really doesn't make any sense that computers would be able to write docs that humans can read. Like, we should know this, and yet we don't. The second category I want to talk about is overly verbose instructions. So sometimes there's just way too much information. Excuse me. 2 summers ago, we wanted to kind of kickstart our automotive repair section. And so we made oil change guides for all of our employees' cars. So I got free oil change, and they got a guide on how to change the oil in my car, which was pretty crappy back when it was new in 1997 and is absolutely shitty now. But so this guide has 19 steps. This is the end. So 19 steps, if you've changed the oil in your car before, you might be thinking that 19 steps is an awful lot. And we get that comment sometimes from people who are used to working on their cars. They're like, changing oil is a really easy thing to do. Why do you expand to 19 steps? That seems like a lot. And there are 2 parts to this in dealing with too many words. One is classic writing advice from Strunk and White, which is to get rid of words that really don't need to be there, but you're mostly writers, so you're already aware of this. The second thing is that really you need to know your audience, because those 19 steps would actually be really useful for me because I'm not that experienced in changing the oil in my car. And so as a beginner, I need extra little bits and pieces of advice that more experienced people don't necessarily need. But if you're talking to people who are experienced, then they just get extremely frustrated when they have to wade through lots and lots of things to just try and why didn't you just say this? Looking at ways that people have tried to solve this, I took a look at the Django docs. Normally when I'm trying to figure out what to do with the documentation, I look at either Django or the Python request library, because they're the 2 best examples of documentation that I've run across for a large and small software project, respectively. So Django uses a fairly common approach, which is that there's a tutorial at the beginning that goes really slowly, really in depth. It discusses various topics. And then after that, you just get this really in-depth documentation that assumes that you know a lot. And so you kind of have these two levels, and if you're falling somewhere else in between, it's not ideal, but this is about the best that we've come up with. Being a system administrator, I spend a lot of my time on the command line, and one of the things that I love about SSH, which is a remote control program, is that it has 4 possible levels of verbosity. So there's the -v flag, will turn on verbose mode, but you can add it multiple times and it will get progressively more verbose each time you do that. And so you can tune the level of verbosity of the information that's giving you to what you need for that particular situation. And that's a really useful thing, and I wish that we could find a way to do that with documentation in general. Have some sort of, verbosity slider, and you can pull it back and forth and be like, this is too much information or too little. I don't really know how to do that in a way that still makes the tone consistent without having to just write 4 different versions of your document, and no one really wants to do that. So if you have any ideas about that, talk to me. Finally, I want to talk about poka-yoke, or mistake proofing. I'm sorry if anyone here speaks Japanese, I'm butchering your language. There was an engineer at Toyota some 30, 40 years ago who realized that people will always make mistakes. That's just part of being human. We always make mistakes, but mistakes don't have to become defects in the final product. And so he brought about this idea of explicitly designing human mistakes into your product. This is a really big thing in industrial engineering. There's a guy who documents a bunch of different examples that they're just fascinating. But we haven't really gotten to it in software very much at all. And as a fairly good example, we have a script that that all of our developers use every day. For any Git aficionados, it's loosely based on Git flow. And so when we're pushing out or creating a feature, we need to know whether it's a feature or a hotfix. So that is whether this thing that we're making is really important and it needs to go out as soon as possible, or if it can wait an extra week or 2 and get a little additional care and more eyes on it, that sort of thing. And then at the end, after everyone's looked at it and approved it, and we're determining how to merge it and push it out, then the person doing that needs to also know whether it was created as a feature or a hotfix. And we used to just have a line in our documentation that was like, this is how you determine if this is a feature or if it's a hotfix, and make sure you do the right thing, because if you don't, then bad things will happen. And they're particularly annoying because they're not things that are immediately apparent. It's only apparent like 30 minutes later, and then other people have started working off of that, and it's just a giant pain, and we get to deal with it for the next hour. And one day I realized that I was just being stupid. Like, this is a stupid design for a tool. Documentation is not the right answer here. The right answer here is to make the software not do the wrong thing. So I just add in a really quick little like 30-line diff, and if you're trying to do a hotfix merge and we determine it's actually a feature, that's just going to warn you and be like, are you really sure that you want to do this? Because sometimes, occasionally, you do want to do the wrong thing. I run into that fairly frequently. That's why I'm a Linux systems administrator. And so that provides just enough of a little reminder that if you are just tired that day, you're not quite paying attention, you're in the routine of things, they'll be like, are you really sure you want to do this? You're like, yeah, no, actually I didn't want to do that, and you'll do the right thing instead. And so oftentimes the solution is actually not to write documentation to solve these, it's just to fix your damn product so that it works right. So in summary, don't let computers write docs for other humans. Write with an appropriate level of verbosity for your audience, and fix product failures instead of trying to document around them when at all possible. That obviously requires you to be close with your product team. This is best if, well, I run across this most because we don't have a dedicated documentation team for our software, so it's us documenting our own things. So instead of documenting it, we just fix it. So that's the summary, and I believe we have time for questions.